and make a note of time. And yeah, some.
Okay, thank you. My name is Sam Delanos. I will be speaking about conversal cosmology, survival, recognition, and the aesthetics of the wound. Let me begin with a paradox. In inquisitorial Spain, the absence of proof did not mean innocence. It often means survival. Silence was not emptiness. It was pressure. It was concealment. It was strategy. Thus, the lack of proof is itself a historical trace. When I say proof, I do not mean abstract philosophical certainty. I mean concrete institutional proof. Proof of ancestry, proof of blood purity, proof of Christian orthodoxy, proof of lineage, proof of religious sincerity. These were not neutral documents, they were survival threshold. To fail to produce empire's proof meant expulsion, imprisonment, confiscation, or death. To erase proof, to alter names, destroy records, remain silent was often the only way to live. So when I say the lack of proof is itself a trace, I mean this. What is missing in this archive is often missing because people made themselves invisible to stay alive. And we should be clear, this does not mean there is no proof at all. Much of the proof we do have comes from inquisitional records. List of the burned, list of imprisoned, list of confiscated, trial summaries, charges, and sentences. Often what remains is nothing more than a name. For example, Hernan Galvez, recorded as one of the earliest heretics burned in the Americas for observing the law of Moshe. That single line sometimes is all that survives. No biography, no family archive, only fragments, only the mark of punishment. These records were not created to preserve lives. They were created to discipline, expose, and erase, which means the archive we inherit is structurally incomplete by design. Hernan Galvez is my ancestor. His heretical offense, practicando la ley de Moshe, is the only survival fragment of his existence available. This is why converso history cannot be reconstructed from documents alone. When we place these fragments into wider patterns, surnames, migration routes from Iberia to Portugal, from Portugal to Spain, the Ottoman world, and to Amsterdam and Italy, to culinary continuities, domestic survival practices, and community memory, something else becomes visible. Not proof in the inquisitorial sense, but recognition in the survival sense. And it's crucial to say this clearly. Being a converso did not always mean being a crypto Jew. It meant inhabiting a condition of genealogical suspicion, cultural fracture, and enforced concealment. It was historical formation, not a single religious behavior. And this creates a methodological problem for how we normally write history. Because when archives are produced by persecuting institutions, silence is not absence. It is evidence of survival. So the question becomes, how do we read history when survival required erasure? This is the problem conversal cosmology addresses. Conversal cosmology argues that Iberian persecution generated survival-based epistemology and aesthetics practice in which truth was displaced into form, memory into fragment, and identity into coded expression. This mode of knowing, I'm trying to do this here. Okay, this mode of knowing traveled through medieval Sephardic diaspora networks into the Spanish Baroque, where it becomes legible in Cervantes' fractured narration, Velázquez's displaced optics of power, and Góngора's compressed poetic capacity. This pressure-born logic ultimately crystallizes in philosophically and Spinoza's ethics, making its entry into modern thought. Now I need to clarify what I mean by cosmology. This is not a metaphorical language. I'm not using it poetically. I'm using it precisely. A cosmology is not simply a story about the universe. It is a total orientation system, how people understand time, memory, authority, truth, survival, embodiment, and meaning. What I'm arguing is this: Converso existence did not produce only a demographic category. It produced a world logic. Forced conversions, surveillance, and genealogical persecution did not merely alter religious affiliation, they reorganized how truth is recognized, how identity is carried, how memory survives, how art functions, how silence operates, how ethics are practiced. That is a cosmology. Historiography traditionally treats conversos as a footnote, a marginal group, a transitional anomaly, a documentation problem. But historically, conversos were not marginal, they were structural. They occupied the hinge position between medieval plural Iberia and modern homogenized Europe. They were not outside history, they were embedded into its machinery. And because they were embedded under coercion, they developed survival logic and reshaped modern consciousness itself. Fragmentation, double coded speech, irony, anonymity, polyphony, displacement of identity into form. It is a needed intervention by removing the converso from historical footnote and marginalization into its own cosmology. And this is why converso history cannot be treated as an archival curiosity. It must be understood as a civilizational pressure system. Think of a pressure cooker, and that steam needs to go out somewhere. That produced a new way of inhabiting reality. That is why I call it conversal cosmology, not because it's mystical, but because it names a complete survival ontology forged inside persecution. To understand conversal cosmology, we must understand the environment that produced it. And the environment does not begin with the Inquisition. According to Shevet Yehuda, the Staff of Judah, by Shlomo Ibn Verga, a 16th century Sephardi exilee and historian of Jewish persecution, large populations of forcibly converted Jews already existed generations before the Limpieza de Sangre statues and the inquisitorial tribunals that were formally established. What emerges first is not law, but atmosphere. A persecuting society forms before its bureaucratic codification. Ibn Verga describes entire cities of new Christians living under constant suspicion, popular hostility, economic pressure, rumor economies, scapegoating, and episodic violence. The Inquisition does not invent this condition. It organizes it. It formalizes it. It gives legal machinery to a social reality that already exists. Only after the social pressure ecology is in place do we see the institutional crystallization. Forced conversions, limpieza de sangre laws, surveillance culture, racialization, purity ideology, imperial anxiety, inquisitional bureaucracy. This is the pressure environment that later crystallizes aesthetically in the Spanish Baroque. Under this pressure, identity becomes aesthetic, memory becomes coded, truth migrates into irony, allegory, parody, polysemy. Art becomes a survival technology. Anonymity and or multi-authorship replaces single authorship. Now we move to a key epistemological and ethical shift. Rabbinic law contains an ethical principle called hazakah, which means continuity as evidence. What persists is presumed valid unless proven otherwise. This matters enormously for persecuted populations. When documents are destroyed, when names are changed, Levi ben Yehuda becomes Pedro Sanchez. When records are falsified or lost, memory becomes law. Within conversal cosmology, hazakah becomes ontological. We recognize our own, not sentimentality, but structurally. Recognition replaces confessions. Continuity replaces documentation. This is the opposite of inquisitorial logic, where the Inquisition demanded proof, blood purity, and genealogies. Converso communities preserve belonging through recognition, resonance, embodied memory, food pathways, migration pathways. This logic continues in Amsterdam Sephardic communities. Someone would say, sí, viene de nuestros. Yes, they come from our own. Este es de buena familia. He's from a good family. Meant they're from a Jewish background. These sentences carry more authority than any certificate. After the Inquisition, Sephardic Jewish belonging was rebuilt not through archives, but through recognition. Being became rational or relational rather than documentary. This is ontology. Hence, halachic belonging after persecution becomes relational, not archival. Now we move into ontology. Heidegger speaks of thrownness, being born into conditions we did not choose. We are thrown into a family we did not choose, parents we did not pick. For Converso descendants, thrownness is not abstract, it is genealogical. We are born into erased archives, altered names, broken transmission, and suspended belonging. I call this condition being in the wound. Existence lived through historical rupture, not healed, not closed, but inhabited. This wound becomes productive. Like Jacob's lip wrestling the angel, the injury becomes a covenant inscription. The wound becomes a mark of the covenant. For conversos, our embodied memories, our trauma, are the same wound mark of the covenant, where the wound becomes a site of knowing. From this wound emerges what I call the aesthetics of kura, from the Hebrew root word kara, to tear. Example, tearing or rending your clothes as a sign of mourning or grief. Beauty born from fracture, art as survival grammar, not ornament, but medicine. Let me ground this in something concrete. In my family, every weekend my mother cooked cocido, slow stew with Swiss chard, potato broth, either beef, lamb, or chicken. For us, it was just our food. Later, I learned that Swiss chard and overnight stews were signature markers of Sephardic Sabbath cooking that was monitored by inquisitional informants. What I thought was domestic routine was actually cryptic inheritance, not proof, but continuity. This is conversal cosmology in the body. Ontology becomes geography. We are walking medieval Iberia. Memory becomes taste. Survival becomes habit. And fragments of lost plural civilization is carried in kitchens, in accents, and in gestures. Walter Benjamin gives us the language to understand this condition. He writes, even the dead are not safe if the enemy wins. Conversal memory survives not in monuments, but in fragments, in ruins, in recipes, in names, and in silences. Benjamin calls this the weak messianic power, the fragile capacity of later generations, like mine, to redeem unfinished lives. Conversal cosmology operates as a weak archive, not centralized, not institutional, but dispersed across bodies and households. It's embodied. To demand notarized proof is to repeat inquisitorial logic. To read fragments as testimony is survival epistemology. Benjamin gives us the theoretical grammar for this condition, but Cervantes gives us the architectural form. What Benjamin describes philosophically, fragments, dispersed memory, unstable authority, Cervantes performs structurally inside the novel itself. In other words, the Baroque does not simply represent fragmentation, it organizes it into form. And this is where conversal cosmology moves from theory into aesthetic technology. We now leave the household archive and enter into the literary one. not to find stable truth, but to watch how survival reorganizes authorship itself. Now we return to the Spanish Baroque. Cervantes does something unprecedented. He inserts a fictional Arab historian, Cide Hamate Bengali, as the true author of Don Quixote. This is not a joke. It stages authorship itself as displaced. The narrator claims to offer an absolutely true history, yet constantly reminds the reader that this is a farce. We never know who truly authored the text. The compiler is obscure. The Arabic manuscript is partial. The translator is unreliable. Authority is fractured by design. This is not confusion. It is Baroque strategy. The narrator becomes what he calls himself, the stepfather of the story, a gatherer of fragments, an archivist without origin, documenting absurdity with obsessive seriousness. Then something else strange happens. In part two, Don Quixote becomes aware of a false Don Quixote. Avelanda's unauthorized sequel. The character realizes his own story has been stolen. Art escapes its creator. Truth becomes contested. Narrative control collapses. This is modernity under pressure. Inside the novel, everything is treated as documented fact. Outside the novel, the reader knows it's fiction. Cervantes pushes realism to absurdity. An ancient knight wandering early modern Spain, archived by unreliable narrators. This is why Don Quixote becomes the first modern novel, not simply because of irony, but because identity itself becomes unstable. Don Quixote speaks the language of epic heroes while living among printing house presses, firearms, and bureaucracies. He tests whether modern society still carries noble ideals. And the test fails. What remains is disillusionment. And this brings us to the Baroque Code. I'm not making an archival claim about Cervantes' ancestry. I'm making a recognition claim. Under persecution and blood purity regimes, direct speech becomes dangerous. Meaning migrated into form. The Baroque survival logic looks like this: narrative fractures instead of testimony, irony instead of declaration, polysemy instead of clarity, mask instead of fixed identity, formal excess instead of open argument, anonymity instead of authorship. Cervantes does not declare forbidden memory. He builds it into structure. And this is why, for those formed by the historical wound, Cervantes becomes legible as one of our own, not by proof, but by resonance, by recognition. This is how the Baroque form becomes survival technology. And once the survival logic enters aesthetic form, it does not remain confined to literature. It's portable, it migrates, it becomes the hidden grammar of modern subjectivity itself, which means modernity does not begin with clarity, it begins with displacement. Modernity is often told as enlightenment, clarity, rational progress, liberation from superstition. Converso cosmology reframes this story. Modernity does not emerge clean. It emerges through pressure. It emerges through forced purification, erasure of plural inheritance, replacement of memory with bureaucratic proof, conversion of life into documentation regimes. The Baroque is not decorative excess. It is pressure art, form produced under surveillance, censorship, and fracture. And modern subjectivity is born transparent. It is born wounded. It is not born transparent, it's born wounded. It is born inside a system that demands visibility, proof, and legibility, while simultaneously erasing entire populations and memories. Converso cosmology names this hidden genealogy of modern consciousness, a modernity built not only on reason, but on displacement, not only on progress, but on survival under constraint. Let me close where I began, with proof. At the grave of Berlin, Henrietta de Lemos Hertz, another ancestor, a Christian burial site, Jewish memory archive. Proof into one thing, memory says another. Only recognition can hold both. And this is the ethical heart of Converso cosmology. not proof as domination, not exposure as violence, but recognition as repair. We recognize our own, not to exclude others, but to restore erased formations, not to mythologize suffering, but to honor endurance. The lack of proof is not emptiness. The lack of proof is often a self a trace. It was produced under historical pressure. It carries survival inside it. And if we learn how to read it, not as absence, but as inheritance, that is enough to begin. Thank you.
Wonderful. And exactly on time. 20 minutes. Okay. Fantastic. Wow.
Thank you.
Sam, you so intricately woven the material history that you are referring to. You're thinking with the concepts you have formulated, immersing into the history, but lifting them above above the historical moments as well. So that was amazing.
Thank you.
So while you think about your questions, because you went very deep and into different directions. Um, I'm intrigued by what you said about the modern subject and the inquisitional logic. So there is an alignment between the two. Right, in a way that the modern subject is created, is born within that wound, that blow, that the Quasinteria logic is striking with any sense of identity. I mean, there's a different kind of continuity, which is not of identity in your thinking. Um, this, you gave me so much to think about that I'm just formulating the question in my head. Um, but the question has to do with the history of the conversions and as a condition of being that is beyond that history as well. And I think you rewriting the history of the idea, but also the historical phenomenon of the Western and modern subject through your findings about the conversions and the distinction between the proof and the archived proof and the instituted proof of the archive and the recognition as an act of survival. I think also
Mhm.
of resistance. That's very clear and that's very striking. I know that my question is not very clear yet, but yeah, maybe say a few words about how you think the inquisitorial logic is related or aligned to modern subjectivity, and is the converse so also does it lend itself to a philosophical critique of the concept of subjectivity in its modernity. Let's start from there and we'll see. Yeah.
Okay, so the Inquisitional. Okay, so we recently went to Madrid and listened to Miss Sandoval talk about the Baroque period in Las Meninas, and it was exactly the opposite of what I felt as I've written it already before she spoke. That the Baroque was not a ex nihilo. Didn't just happen out of nowhere. It happened. What I'm writing is it happened out of a lot of pressure. The pressure of the Inquisition, which was always um, observing, watching, making sure people are in line, not just. And this is what it gets interesting: is Jews no longer are there anymore. They had been kicked out in 1492, so everybody that remained was Christian.
Yeah. Yeah.
But the problem is that the Converso really never fit that Christian mold. They were a marginalized group through their background, uh, through their background, and so the Inquisition was there to kind of formally observe the society, making sure that they were uh, doing and behaving as Christians should behave in that society, which caused a lot of pressure because they were wanting to speak out uh, in ways, but they couldn't speak out in clarity. It had to be subverted to polysemy or through polyphony or through anonymity or through obscure ways of talking about what was happening in society. And that's why, like in that book, Lazarillo de Tormes, it had to be authored and anonymously because it critiques Spain, it critiques the priesthood, it critiques the nobility, it critiques all the things that make Spain Spain at that time, which is near absurd in the way that they treated people, and so it had to be anonymous, and this caused artists like Velasquez to frame power in opacity. We never see the king and queen in its fullness.
Mm.
It's kind of hidden in the back, and what we do see is the framing of the La Infanta, the next person in the line of the regime, as a whimsical figure of authority. It's all critique,
Mm. Mm.
if that makes sense.
Yeah, 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 yeah. It makes sense. I mean, this is so interesting because I think you're registering this historical, metaphysical, existential, I don't know, movement, because he says that it was not the Inquisition as that historical moment that invented the condition of the Converso.
No, it was prior to that.
It was
Yeah.
certainly prior to that, but it reorganized it.
Hmm.
Yeah, yeah, and then comes later the other moment that out of this condition, the modern subject is been born as a wound. So in that movement, it seems to be another instance where this is reorganized in response to or out of the wound.
Yes.
And it makes me think again the modern subject as a response to the wound that is there, uh,
Hmm.
trying to heal the wound by becoming something else, which is in a way more aligned to the inquisitorial logic, to assert itself, to identify itself, and this is also
Yes.
force of
Yeah,
autonomy.
and it really formalizes itself in Spinoza, and in Spinoza's ethics, and especially in Joseph Natura as God and nature. He is trying to remove every form of using God as a weapon as possible because we know that God was weaponized in Iberia, Portugal,
Yes.
and it was almost weaponized. There's instances of weaponization of God in Amsterdam, and he's just trying to remove every form of fear from the idea of what God is to us in a metaphysical sense,
Mm-hmm.
so that it crystallizes very much so philosophically, and that's why Nietzsche says my tutor was Spinoza. because he uses the same logic as in Thus Spoke the Zarathustra, that God is dead. At all these
Mm,
things. So,
mm.
which it's very deep.
It is. Right, I'm conscious of the time, so anyone else? Does anyone else have a question for Sam?
Sam, that was really great. And I was really impressed by that. I have a question. So just on a personal level, what do you think? I don't want to put you on the spot, but what do you think the reason is for this um, continuous persecution of the Jews from so long ago and then peaking at certain points in history ultimately? I'm just curious what you think. But I
It's
really
in
like
it.
your connection with art because I never looked at it that way before, so it's completely changed how I view this whole genre. So thanks for that.
Thank you. Well, the idea of anti-Semitism is it's a new word actually. I think born right around maybe the Dreyfus affair. It used to be it used to be called back in Liberia Jew hatred.
Mhm.
Okay, but that had an emotional attachment because hatred has an emotional attachment to it. Do you see where I'm going with this? So it had to change into something much more formal, anti-Semitism, uh, to kind of disattach itself from the hatred that was originally framed in. And yes, there are peak periods of time that create this kind of hatred, for a lack of a better word, and scapegoating. But it's kind of embedded in Europe. It's a European, I don't know, legacy in a sense, and Russian as well, but Russian a little less than Europe. Europe has a very strong legacy of distaste for Jews and Arabs, and more the Moors as well. So I don't know what makes it peak, but I see it peak. I see it peak often, and
Um,
it's just the same things that blood libels and all these different categorizations that they don't disappear; they just come back again. So I
do
hope
you
that
think
answers your question.
yeah, just one more piggyback on that. Do you think that it's related to, well, because so much of Christianity is based on the Old Testament, which is, the Torah. So how is that? Do you think there's some sort of you know, jealousy or some sort of conflict internally with that seeding kind of thing or something like that?
I
Or when
think I
Christianity
It
rises?
has to do with power. It has to do with politics and power. A lot of it, because you're right. The foundations of Christianity is Judaism. It's a no-brainer. Uh, and but then there's this supersessionism that happens with Christianity, where it's the new way, it's the new law. It supersedes the old law, and we have this kind of um, but the interesting thing that in Al Andalus they had a plural society with Christians, uh, Moors, and Jews got along together for nearly 1,000 years, and it worked really wonderful in that period. And that's really what we're searching for. As when I say walking Iberia, I mean we're searching for that plurality. We're searching for that place where we could all get along, if that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you.